This is where it becomes clear. The structure behind this is clear. Patient flow is not driven by one action. It's protected across 5 connected stages: capture, referrals, nurture, reactivation, reputation, not as separate efforts, but as one integrated system. That's what class represents. Not marketing, lifecycle infrastructure. Installed, calibrated, aligned to the practice. Correctly. Each of these pillars protects a different moment in the life cycle. Starting with the very first one. It starts at the very beginning with the first pillar. Capture. Capture ensures that interest becomes connection. Someone hears about the practice. They visit the website. They call the office. They ask a question. And in that moment, intent is present. But intent is fragile. If that moment is not supported, it fades. Missed calls, forms that go unanswered, messages that don't receive a response. Not because the interest wasn't real, because nothing happened fast enough. And when that happens, the person moves on, not intentionally, but naturally, because the moment passed. Capture closes that gap. It ensures that when intent appears, something happens, immediately. So, nothing disappears. Because if the first moment is missed, the rest of the life cycle never begins. This is the question most practices never ask clearly enough. Would you know if patient intent was appearing right now? Would you know if someone visited the site and didn't convert? If someone called but never booked? If someone intended to move forward but the moment simply faded? Most practices believe they would notice, but unless capture is structured, many of those moments remain invisible. And if the moment is invisible, it can't be protected. That's what makes capture so important. Because awareness without visibility is still guesswork. And guesswork doesn't create stability. Once the initial interaction is protected, the next stage begins to matter. Once care is experienced, the second pillar begins to matter. Referrals. Referrals are not random events. They follow structure and timing. A patient experiences care. That experience creates certainty. Certainty builds trust. And trust becomes recommendation. That is not marketing. That is human behavior. Which means referrals are not simply something to ask for. They are something the practice must be ready to support at the right moment. Because when trust is highest, the opportunity appears. And if that moment is not supported, the referral doesn't disappear loudly. It disappears quietly. And over time, that quiet loss reduces growth without ever being labeled clearly. Referrals don't start when you ask for them. They start in a moment like this. A friend mentions pain. A family member asks a question. And without much thought, a name is shared. That's the moment. Patients don't announce when they decide to recommend you. There's no signal, no notification. It happens quietly. And in that moment, they're not comparing options. They're recalling certainty, who they trust, who they feel confident sending someone to. That's what determines which practice gets recommended. Referrals don't come from pressure. They come from certainty. And that moment, like all others in the life cycle, is brief. Referrals don't fail because care is weak. They fail because time passes. The moment was real. It just wasn't protected. A patient leaves feeling relief, trust, validation. And in that moment, they're most likely to recommend you. But if that moment is not supported, it fades. Not because they didn't want to, because nothing carried it forward. The patient means to recommend, but the introduction never happens. The conversation shifts, and the referral is lost before the practice ever sees it. Referrals don't disappear due to lack of intent. They disappear when the moment is unsupported. And that's the shift. Infrastructure doesn't pressure that moment. It enables it. But not every patient moves immediately. And that's where the next stage becomes important. Not every decision happens immediately. which is where the third pillar begins. Nurture. Not every patient decides immediately. Some need time, more certainty, more reinforcement. They may intend to book, but hesitation slows the decision. And that doesn't mean demand is weak. It means hesitation is present, not rejection. Nurture exists to support the period between interest and action, without pressure, without hype, just clear reinforcement at the right time. So, the patient can move forward with confidence, because without that support, time doesn't clarify decisions, it dissolves them. Hesitation doesn't mean lack of interest. It usually means lack of clarity. Patients are considering cost, what to expect, timing, whether now is the right moment. And when those questions aren't supported, they hesitate. When hesitation is unsupported, it turns into silence. No response. No booking. Not because they weren't interested, because uncertainty remained. But when structure is present, that hesitation begins to resolve. Questions get answered, expectations become clear, and uncertainty becomes confidence. That's the difference. Without structure, hesitation becomes silence. With structure, hesitation becomes clarity, and clarity allows decisions to move forward. Nurture is not extra communication. It is architecture designed to support decision-making before intent disappears. And over time, not all relationships continue automatically. Not every relationship continues on its own. The fourth pillar is reactivation. Many patients who stop coming did not choose to leave. They drift. Life became busy. Pain changed. Schedules shifted. Momentum weakened. That does not mean the relationship ended. It means the relationship lost continuity. Reactivation exists to reconnect patients who already trust the practice, but whose momentum quietly faded. And timing matters here. A patient 3 months out is different from one 6 months out, and different again from one further removed, because the relationship changes over time. And if that timing is not considered, reconnection becomes inconsistent. But when it is structured, those relationships can be restored, because the trust already exists. This is especially true with families. There's a pattern that often goes unnoticed. One person misses a visit, then another. Schedules shift, routines change, and over time the family relationship begins to weaken. Not all at once, gradually. Not because care failed, not because something went wrong, because continuity was not protected. And that's what makes family drift structural. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, and over time it becomes permanent if nothing intervenes. But when reactivation is structured correctly, those relationships can be reconnected before they disappear. Because this isn't about pressure, it's about continuity. Before any of that even begins, the final part of the life cycle, before a patient ever reaches out, is reputation. Before a patient ever contacts the practice, a decision is already forming, not based on conversation, not based on care, but based on what they can see. Reviews, signals, proof. Patients don't assume a practice is trustworthy. They look for evidence. And when that evidence is inconsistent, unclear, or missing, certainty never fully forms. Which means the decision slows before the practice ever has a chance to influence it. And timing matters here as well, because the strongest signals are created when certainty is highest. Moments of relief, trust, validation, the same moments that create referrals. And when those moments are supported, reputation grows consistently. Because reputation is not random. It follows structure just like every other part of the life cycle. Even if you are the best clinician in your city, that's not what patients evaluate first. Before they call, before they book, they look for proof, recent reviews, consistent activity, visible outcomes, signals of trust before contact. And those signals shape behavior, because when those signals are weak, hesitation appears. Patients wait, they delay, they continue looking. But when those signals are strong, decisions accelerate. Not because demand increased, but because resistance decreased. Reputation does not create demand. Demand already exists. Reputation removes friction from demand that's already there. And when that friction is removed, momentum feels natural, not forced. When reputation is structured correctly, something changes inside the practice. Fewer patients arrive uncertain. Fewer conversations need to build trust from the beginning. Fewer decisions stall at the point of scheduling, because much of that work has already been done before the patient ever reaches out. That's what stable systems do. They reduce the amount of momentum that depends on constant attention, which means less supervision and more focus, more time supporting patients who are already ready to move forward. By this point, the pattern becomes clear. Practices tend to operate in one of two ways: reactive or designed. Reactive practices wait for instability to appear, then try to correct it with effort. Designed practices build systems that protect momentum before instability appears. What we described earlier as drift is simply what happens inside reactive systems. That's the distinction. Not busy versus lazy, not good versus bad, reactive versus designed. At this point, the question becomes specific. Where is the weakness? Capture, referrals, nurture, reactivation, reputation. Most practices don't struggle everywhere. They struggle at specific points. Yesterday you identified the leak. Today you can identify its category. You don't need to solve all of them. Just notice the area that feels least protected. That's usually where instability begins, because the system is only as strong as its weakest stage. And once you can see where the weakness is, another pattern starts to appear. Systems rarely fail because the idea is wrong. They fail because calibration is wrong. Calibration is simple. The right things are happening, just not at the right time, not in the right sequence, not aligned with how the practice actually operates. Messages arrive too early or too late. Processes don't match behavior. And when that happens, the system feels inconsistent. But the issue is not the model, it's the calibration. That's where systems break, not in theory and execution. This is where most practices misinterpret the problem. By now, the structure probably makes sense. You can see the life cycle, the pillars, how momentum behaves, but understanding is not the same as installation. Understanding creates awareness. Installation creates stability. And that distinction matters, because many practices know the right ideas, but knowledge alone does not protect momentum. Installed systems do. And that's the shift. Not learning more, but installing what already makes sense. This is where many practices try to build their own system. They create reminders, test follow-up messages, set up simple automation, and for a short time, some improvement appears. But isolated improvements don't create coordinated architecture. Without coordination, the system becomes fragmented. And fragmented systems rarely stay stable, because the issue is not effort, it's depth. And that's why DIY systems so often stall. And this is where something important becomes clear. At this point, many doctors notice something important: relief. Because this was never meant to be their lane. You were trained to diagnose, to treat, to improve patient outcomes. That's your expertise. That's where your focus belongs. But lifecycle architecture requires something different: structure, timing, system design around the patient journey. And most doctors were never trained in that, which is why this often feels outside your role. And that's not weakness, that's specialization. Because the issue is not the doctor, it's the absence of structure around the care. There are two paths. You can build it yourself or install it correctly. If you build it yourself, it requires months of mapping, testing, calibrating, and debugging. Even then, there's high friction, high variability, and it requires constant technical oversight. You install it correctly, using a proven architecture, installed the right way, from the start, And that difference matters. There's no shame in either path, but they are not the same path. Once that decision becomes clear, another distinction emerges. That distinction shows up clearly in how practices operate. Many practices quietly normalize instability. They accept fluctuations, unpredictability, inconsistency. It becomes part of how things operate. But instability is not inevitable. It's structural, which means it can be redesigned. Normalize drift, or design stability. That's the distinction. And once that distinction is clear, the next step becomes much simpler. Today, we focused on architecture, how patient momentum behaves, what protects it, and where it breaks. By now, that structure should feel clear, but understanding is not installation, and installation is what creates stability. At this point, most practices can already see where their system is breaking. So tomorrow we take the next step, not conceptually, operationally, what it actually takes to make this work inside a real practice.